This is video number 2, and it's about the second day. In the King James translation, he called it the second day. I call it the second period of time. After the Big Bang, there was a period of darkness, and I illustrated this by a magnifying glass showing that there was elementary particles there, but they were just too thin to detect. It was just within the past few years that they actually found elementary particles in the universe, and this is a picture from NASA that shows elementary particles, and they did it some way with a space telescope and figured out how to detect them. So eventually the universe was filled with elementary particles from micro to infinity throughout the universe. In time, gravity separated the even fog into patches of clouds, like patches of clouds in the sky. There's zillions of patches of clouds throughout the universe of elementary particles. So gravity took each cloud individually and drawn it together more tightly, and as it pulled together, it began to rotate. And the more it pulled together, the faster it rotated, and pretty soon it flattened out into a disk. And eventually after that, the disk was spinning at ultrasonic speeds and created jets that spewed out hydrogen atoms. So hydrogen atoms fill the universe. With the top of the quasar produced hydrogen and the bottom produced antihydrogen. So you had matter and antimatter being produced throughout the universe with zillions of quasars. These were the first generation quasars, and they were actually seen and photographed by the Spitzer telescope. And they didn't have visible disk. They just had the jets. They had the bright, brilliant light and jets that in this assumption, they spewed out hydrogen, and from the bottom, antihydrogen, because when anything rotates, one side rotates clockwise and the other side counterclockwise. So it would stand to reason that one side would produce hydrogen and the other side antihydrogen. If you view this girl on this bicycle from her right-hand side going forward, the bicycle wheel, the front wheel will rotate, well, the back one too, will rotate clockwise. And if you view it with her on her left-hand side going the other way, or, well, going the same way even, but from the left-hand side, the front wheel will rotate counterclockwise. So that shows anything that rotates in two different directions at the same time. So it stands to reason that quasars would produce hydrogen from one side and antihydrogen from the other side on these first generation quasars. This illustration shows the mechanics of the matter and antimatter, and the blue disk you see right in the center is a cloud of elementary particles. And all the little quasars you see within that disk are the first generation quasars, represent them. And from the top of the jets you have matter, which is being produced, and it goes up and makes a cloud of hydrogen, which could be seen. And then from the cloud of hydrogen, the second generation quasars formed, and they produced our universe of regular matter. Now down below that is just a mirror image, and the same thing happened, except it was antimatter, and you got a cloud of hydrogen, antihydrogen, and your second generation quasars of antimatter form from that cloud of hydrogen and produce the antimatter universe. Now this assumption does fit with Genesis 1:7, where it says that God made a firmament firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. So it does fit with the Bible. So the first generation quasars produced hydrogen and filled the universe with hydrogen. Just an even fog of hydrogen throughout the universe. Now the Kobe seen this cloud of hydrogen, and they call it the cosmic background radiation, and it's just a even fog, but its temperatures varied, some cold spots and some hot spots. And the boomerang telescope zoomed in on it and found structures within it. So this is a really interesting thing, and it filled the universe, and so it was just hydrogen gas is all that was there in this period of time. So gravity took over, and this big cloud of hydrogen was broken up into smaller clouds of hydrogen that fill the universe, zillions of them. So each cloud, gravity took over into each individual cloud and pulled it together tighter and tighter, and as it pulled together it began to rotate. And as it rotated tighter and tighter, as gravity pulled it more and more, it flattened out into a disk. And as gravity pulled it more and more, the disk spun faster and faster, and pretty soon it started to spew out neutrons from the jets. And that's how you make neutrons, is compress hydrogen atoms into neutrons. So this is when neutrons were born. Now this is an illustration of a second generation quasar with a visible disk, and you can see the hydrogen gas being drawn in by gravity, and it flattened out and spun tremendous speeds at the center, and that produced neutrons. So the reason that hydrogen don't have any neutrons is because they had to form first to make neutrons. This shows a little bit closer of what could have went on with second generation quasars. The yellow jet you see going up through this circle of hydrogen that was drawn up around the jet was neutrons. And then these hydrogen atoms were sucked up around it in surges. And that's why this abundance of element table looks like a jagged saw blade, is because these surges produced a whole lot of elements in a surge, and then the surge went down and it produced less elements, and then it was caught up into another surge and a heavier element was produced. So this went on and on, back and forth, and all the heavier elements were produced by these quasars. Now this chart shows the abundance of chemical elements from the beginning, and as you can see over to your left in the pink letters, that hydrogen and oxygen were the most abundant. Well, helium, but helium went on in to form the sun. And hydrogen and oxygen was left in the protoplanetary rings, and it was mostly water, like seawater. A big pool of seawater contains just a very few heavy elements. So that's why it's just the way they were produced. The heavier elements were less abundant because of the way they had to form, and it took longer to form a heavy element than it did a lighter element, and so that's why you got less of them. They're more complicated. And this also shows the last few heavy elements that form the core of the Earth, and we'll get to that in a minute. So now the universe was filled with a fog of chemical elements. And all the heavier elements, all the basic 92 elements, and probably on past that, all the elements that contain neutrons were not in this cloud. Some of them had to form different ways, but most of them were. And this cloud contained the heavier elements with neutrons. And we get back to the same mechanics. Gravity took over and broke the cloud apart into patches of clouds throughout the universe, and so the universe was filled with zillions of clouds they call them molecular clouds because they were made out of all the chemical elements, and some of the chemical elements started to band together and forming molecules. So they were tiny molecules within these clouds, but mostly just like fine dust. So, same mechanics. Gravity took over, took each individual cloud and pulled it together tighter, and as it pulled together tighter, it began to rotate. And as it began to rotate, gravity pulled it much more tighter, and as it did, it flattened out into a disk. And then gravity pulled it more tighter, and the disk rotated faster. And that's the birth of our galaxies. And it could have had a jet. Gravity, some galaxies had jets, some of the older ones, way back when they first formed. And then the jet disappeared and turned into a black hole instead of a jet. Here's another illustration that shows the eddy current forming within the disk, and as you can see, there wasn't any star there yet. It was just a big cloud of rotating elements, of all the different elements in rotation. And it was mostly hydrogen and oxygen, so it would be like a big muddy disk of seawater. As time went on, all these solar systems produced stars at the center, and a brown dwarf first, and well, a planet, then a brown dwarf, planet like Jupiter, brown dwarf, 80 times larger than Jupiter, and then eventually they become stars, and the disk lit up, and it looked like our Milky Way does today. Now, back in 1995, when I first got on the Discovery web pages on the scientific forum, everybody laughed because I said that planets and everything formed from disks of water, and they thought that was really funny. But here lately, science has actually photographed these disks of water like our solar system formed, so it's not so funny after all. It's real. This is an illustration of our solar system when it first started to form, and the sun was not a star yet. It was a brown dwarf. It started off as a planet like Jupiter and then grew into a brown dwarf about 80 times as large as Jupiter. And then it finally reached fusion and became a star. This is a cutaway view of the same picture, and it shows the inside of the disk. And the lighter elements on the outside are the lighter elements. Well, lighter in color, lighter the elements, and the dark black elements on the inside are the solid elements that form the planets. If you want an example of how these layers came about, think of a big fat hamburger on the sidewalk and somebody stepped on it and squished it down flat like gravity would have pulled this in. It would have all spread out into a larger disk, and the lighter elements would have been real thin over the top, and underneath the heavy elements would remain inside, and that would be like the meat of the hamburger.